Among the stranger survival accounts to come out of the Korean War, none is as controversial or as misunderstood as what post-war analysts later nicknamed adrenaline recycling. The term never appeared in medical journals or military training manuals. It surfaced instead in oral histories, interrogation survival debriefs, and private interviews with American, British, Turkish, and South Korean prisoners who survived long-distance marches, forced labor, and prolonged deprivation. The idea sounds like pseudoscience until you look at the pattern. A subset of POWs consistently outperformed others under identical starvation and exhaustion. Some lasted 2 hours longer on forced marches. Others stayed coherent while their peers collapsed. And almost all of them described the same mental sequence, what they called catching the surge, holding the push, or riding the spike. It wasn't superhuman strength. It wasn't a chemical stimulant. It was a physiological self-regulation pattern, a high-stress autopilot the men didn't consciously invent, but learned through repetition, trauma, and necessity. The military never turned it into doctrine, and for good reason. The technique relied on dangerous stress loads, unpredictable endocrine responses, and survival circumstances that cannot, and should not be replicated, but historically, it reveals something extraordinary about human physiology under extreme conditions. During the winter of 1950-51, United Nations prisoners captured after the retreat from the Yalu River faced marches so brutal that, honestly, thousands died before reaching permanent camps. Survivors reported something unusual. The men who lasted the longest didn't necessarily start out the strongest. Some were thin, malnourished, or even injured. What they did share was an ability to stay mentally engaged during adrenaline spikes rather than burning themselves out in the first 15 minutes. Interrogators and medical officers, heard the same story over and over. When the body's adrenaline surge hit, and it always did during cold exposure, fear, or physical crisis, most prisoners panicked, sprinted, or just burned through their reserves. The smaller group did something different. They stabilized their breathing, slowed their panic response, and allowed the surge to level out. They didn't extend adrenaline. They didn't create more of it. They simply avoided wasting the limited burst their body had already produced. In extreme deprivation, that difference bought time, sometimes hours. So, physiologically, you just can't recycle adrenaline. Once it's released, it's metabolized really quickly and, well, it doesn't actually return to your system. What prisoners of war were actually doing was, reducing the crash that comes after those adrenaline spikes. These days, exercise physiologists understand the mechanism pretty clearly. First, an adrenaline spike triggers a rapid heartbeat, sharper focus, and mobilizes glucose. Then, panic or really fast overexertion just burns through all that fuel. Finally, the body crashes into glycogen depletion, hypothermia risk, and honestly, confusion. The Korean War survivors, kind of unconsciously, corrected steps 2 and 3. Instead of fighting the surge, they let the adrenaline sort of plateau into a steadier state, what modern researchers might call a stress-regulated performance window. The men described it as, well, the body switching tracks. The effect wasn't superhuman, it was conservation, delaying the crash long enough to endure another ridge, another mile, or another checkpoint. The most skilled survivors weren't simply tough, they used a type of controlled dissociation, what psychologists today call adaptive detachment. They separated the physical strain from the panic response. Accounts describe it this way: I stayed outside the pain but inside the task. The cold was happening, but not to me. I watched myself walk. This wasn't fantasy or hallucination. It was a mental reframing that prevented hyperventilation and energy waste. The POWs who used this state didn't fight the cold or the march. They narrowed their awareness to the immediate step, sometimes to the exact rhythm of boot strike on frozen ground. Many repeated internal patterns, numbers, prayers, cadence phrases that acted as stabilizers. In modern special operations selection, similar mental patterns appear spontaneously under extreme load, but they aren't taught directly. They're emergent responses to conditions that push the body beyond normal pacing. Medical officers who treated survivors in Busan and Tokyo noticed something else. The men who described riding the surge had lower rates of hypoglycemic shock and fewer irregular heart responses. The implication was clear. They weren't creating more endurance, they were avoiding the catastrophic spike and crash cycle. In controlled environments, the effect is modest, but in starvation conditions, the difference becomes enormous. Without enough calories to rebuild glycogen, avoiding the crash extends functional movement far beyond what medical officers believe possible. This is where the phrase 2 hours longer comes from, an estimate repeated in POW hospitals and later in debriefs. It was not a universal number, but a trend seen too consistently to ignore, because it is not safe, not predictable, and not a replicable method for performance enhancement. To recreate the conditions under which the technique emerged would require, well, starvation, hypothermia, long-term stress, sleep deprivation, and forced exertion. No ethical training environment can duplicate that. Moreover, the technique wasn't really a technique, it was actually an accidental convergence of psychology, physiology, and extreme necessity. It belonged to men who had no choice but to survive their next hour or die on frozen roadbeds. Post-war analysts saw the danger immediately. Formalizing it would encourage soldiers to rely on adrenaline instead of calories, conditioning, or logistics. Anything that looks like a super soldier trick usually comes with a hidden cost, and in this case the cost was organ stress, cardiac risk, and long-term metabolic damage. The value of the story is historical, not instructional. The Korean War should have killed many of these men, and it did, but the ones who lived exposed something remarkable about human endurance. The body can survive far longer than expected when the mind stops fighting its own stress response. This wasn't superhuman, it wasn't forbidden chemistry, it was the ability to accept the surge, avoid panic, and let the body's emergency systems operate without interference. It wasn't recycling, it was conservation, turning one short burst into a long plateau. Understanding that gives us insight into human limits, not a recipe for extending them, and as with most real survival knowledge, the truth is far more interesting than the myth. If you want more historically grounded, physiologically accurate survival stories that most people never hear, subscribe to Strange History and share this with those who appreciate deep research over legend.